Welcome, everyone, to our lecture of the Ecclesiastical Law Society. Very good to see you all joining today here on Zoom. Of course, we all know Ukraine has been in the news and in our prayers for most of this year, and indeed for much longer. And ecclesiastical matters are not obviously the main news story, but for members of this society and guests and visitors who are with us today as well, who are very welcome indeed, those matters are of great interest. So it's very good, therefore, to welcome a speaker today who can talk knowledgeably on this topic. Professor Paul Babie is Bonython Chair in Law and Professor of Law and Associate Dean at Adelaide Law School in Australia, and he's also a priest of the Ukrainian Catholic Eparchy, also in Australia. Paul, wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Russell, for that, for the introduction and also for the invitation to join you tonight or this morning in the United Kingdom. It's a great honor for me to be able to deliver this lecture today. I'm going to try to share my screen. I've just got a couple of slides really, so there's not a lot, but I will have to, now hopefully everybody can see that. It should be working now, I think. But so that I can see my own notes, I'll have to not go on to full slideshow, so you'll just see the slides on the side, but I've only got a couple of slides, so that's the first slide, and I'll just put it onto the outline of my lecture now. I want to begin with a caveat, disclaimer. I am a priest of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. I'm not a theologian. I'm not, nor am I an historian. Many of you may be aware of the fact that Timothy Snyder, a professor at Yale University, has made his class, The Making of Modern Ukraine, which actually comprises 23 lectures freely available online this year. For those that want to know more about the geopolitical context of Ukraine, Snyder is definitely the person to turn to for that story. The story of Ukraine itself is vast and far beyond anything that I can do here in my lecture tonight. In fact, the story that I'm going to tell, or the journey that I'm going to take, is just one small part of that vast story. But even that part of the story itself is vast. Indeed, really, a series of lectures could be devoted to each of the parts of my lecture. So what I'm going to say is intended really only as an introduction, largely for those unfamiliar with this story. It will certainly not satisfy scholars in this field. At best, I'm only going to skim the surface, picking up parts to highlight in the hope of providing a very high-level overview of the current state of the Eastern Orthodox or Byzantine Christian churches of Ukraine. Indeed, even then, what I fear most is that I'm going to disappoint everyone. For those familiar with the story, I'm going to present an account which will be seemingly lacking in detail. For those that are not familiar with the story, I have the feeling it may seem bewilderingly complex in its detail. So I apologize in advance to both groups. So I want to take you on a journey through three schisms. The journey begins in the Byzantine Empire, and from there I'll venture into the Slavic lands that would become Ukraine. And the first schism, the Great Schism, which we all know of 1054. And from there, our journey will take us into two, what I call modern schisms. The first of those, what we might call the Little Schism of 1596. And the second, in our own time, the final schism of 2018-2019. Ultimately, though, all roads lead to New Rome. The origins of Ukraine's churches begin in the Byzantine Christianity that emerged in the 4th century Eastern Roman Empire. The story there has two parts. First, the role played by the Byzantine Empire politically in the history of Christianity, and second, how the ecclesiology that developed there shaped Orthodox church governance even to this day. In the 4th century, as we all know, following his conversion and the cessation of state persecution of Christianity, the Emperor Constantine left Rome, the old Rome, and established the new capital at the site of an ancient Greek city on the Bosphorus known as Byzantium, at that time Constantine renamed the new capital Constantinople, which became a new Rome. The shift in treatment of Christianity and the location of the capital forged a Christian empire with faith to some degree influencing government and government to a degree influencing faith. The outcome was a fusion of church and state, at least in the way that people thought about that relationship between church and state. The real outcome of that fusion, though, is probably more of a mindset, as I'll call it. It's been called by others a mindset or a way of thinking about the relationship between church and state and about governance in both spheres, church and state. And we'll see how that mindset continues to this day to shape the Orthodox world, and how its lack of a clear process that results from that mindset results in what can only be described as a tenuous, some might even say messy, means of establishing churches. So while fusion might have failed to prevent disagreement over governance and doctrinal elements of the faith, the Byzantine mindset did develop a means of resolving disputes in the matters in the position of the church. And that was the synod or council in which bishops of the whole inhabited or ecumenical world, summoned by the emperor and guided through the Holy Spirit, issued resolutions which became both laws of the empire and normative of the faith. Over time, those took on the form that we know today as the Ecumenical Council. And during the first millennium of Christianity, as we all know, the ecumenical bishops dealt with three heresies: the Arian, the Monophysite, and iconoclasm. And they dealt with those heresies in 7 ecumenical councils, which I'm not going to recount. I only want to say a couple of things about those councils. First, that they formed the rudiments of Orthodox canon law. The second thing that I want to mention is just the fourth of those councils, which was the Council of Chalcedon in 451, which, as we all know, condemned the Monophysite heresy. The important point there, though, is that that is what perhaps was one of the first cleavages in the Eastern Christian world, when the non-Greek elements of the empire left the church and became what are known as the Monophysite churches. And of course, those that remained became the Chalcedonian churches, or churches of the Chalcedonian tradition. And that is an important part of the story of Ukraine. The final thing that I want to say, which is probably the most important about those 7 ecumenical councils, is that there are 3 canons that were issued in the course of those councils, which established the structure of governance, church governance, that determines the creation of Ukraine's churches. First, the fusion between church and state, between empire and church, meant that the two, empire and church, were adapting similar forms of government. But Canon 6 of the Council of Nicaea, 325, created an exception for the greater sees of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. They were permitted then by way of that exception to exercise their own governance due to their importance as cities in the empire. The second canon is Canon 3 of the First Council of Constantinople in 381, which gave a similar exception to Constantinople itself, to have an exception in relation to its own governance as a church, although it remains subject to the overall primacy of Rome. And the third canon that is important is Canon 26 of the Council of Chalcedon 451, which divided the empire into 5 patriarchates, or the pentarchy, of Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Taken together, those canons meant that the patriarchs of the pentarchy could preside over metropolitan elections and consecrate local bishops within those patriarchal sees. And those powers continue to exist today and form part of the canon law of the Orthodox Church. The source of episcopal power, however, is found in what has come to be known as Eucharistic ecclesiology. And of course, that its greatest exponent is Metropolitan John Zizioulas, and in his magisterial and seminal Being as Communion, he develops a patristic synthesis which places the bishop, and of course the office of the bishop itself was borrowed from Greek Byzantine administrative government, and those were administrative units or dioceses, each with an episkopos or bishop or overseer or inspector. So Zizioulas places the bishop at the center of the liturgical expression of worship, and that emerged in one of its earliest forms in the great church of Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, or in English, Holy Wisdom, where Zizioulas says, at the center of the whole church, behind the one altar, was the throne of the one bishop seated in the place of God and understood as the living image of Christ. And around the bishop gathered the presbyters, assisted by the deacons, and in the presence of the people of God, the faithful. Zizioulas writes, and I quote, "Thus the bishop would become the one through whose hand the whole community would have to pass in its being offered up to God in Christ. In other words, in the highest moment of the church's unity," close quote. So an ontology of the episcopacy emerges from that, and that ontology of the episcopacy is that the one, the bishop, cannot exist without the many, the community, and the many cannot exist without the one. To give you an idea of what that might have looked like in Constantinople, John Binns has written about Hagia Sophia that, and I quote, "The scale of the liturgical life is hinted at by the reforms of Patriarch Sergius, who in 612 decided that things were getting out of control and reduced the number of clergy who served at the Hagia Sophia to a mere 80 priests, 150 deacons, 40 deaconesses, 70 subdeacons, 160 readers, 25 cantors, and 100 doorkeepers," close quote. Each Eucharistic community or local church, though, Zizioulas explains, is not a part of Christ, but the whole Christ, and not a partial or local unity, but the full eschatological unity of all in Christ. The unity of those various local Eucharistic communities was achieved through ordination. Each bishop was consecrated by at least 2 or 3 bishops from the neighboring churches, and this tied the episcopal office, and so therefore each community with the rest of the Eucharistic communities in the world. And each of those communities was in full unity or communion because each one represented the whole Christ, and the bishop, as the head of those communities, was in communion with the others. The senior bishop in each diocese was a metropolitan, and more senior still, as we are probably aware, was the patriarch, who is recognized as the bishop of one of the sees of the pentarchy. Thus, in the same way that the individual is constituted by communion, that the local Eucharistic community is constituted by the one in many and the many in one of the bishop, the universal church consists of many local but whole Eucharistic communities, the whole of the eschatological Christ made one through the communion of the many, or ecumenical bishops. Still, while they are joined by this episcopal ontology and by their Byzantine Chalcedonian origins, the modern Orthodox churches form nothing more than a loose federation, each church of which emerged over time in response to local needs, perhaps the formation of a new nation or a mission church that had sufficiently developed to become independent of a larger mother church. This is the process that we are going to see shortly in Ukraine. In the Byzantine world, a new church was given its independent status by a mother church, and then recognized by the Patriarchate of Constantinople and by other local national churches. 2 levels of independence were and are possible. The first is what is known as autocephaly, or an autocephalous church, which means a church that is self-governing in all respects and capable of selecting and consecrating its own leadership. The second level of independence is autonomy, or an autonomous church, and that has a lesser degree of independence, requiring the blessing and agreement of the mother church in order to consecrate its head. There is no clear process for independence, and this comes back to that point about the Byzantine mindset and the idea of a bit of messiness. A church can be recognized by one church, but not by another. And similarly, while the boundaries of those various independent churches may coincide with national boundaries, that doesn't always need to be the case. So, as I've said, the Byzantine mindset continues to influence the development and the acceptance of new independent churches, and that is a process that appears somewhat messy and tenuous at times. So, a final word about Constantinople. Well, it enjoyed priority as one of the pentarchy. The question arises, how is the patriarch himself viewed, as a local bishop or as an ecumenical or universal patriarch? This matters in the story of Ukraine. The Council of Constantinople of 381 had made the patriarch second in honor to Rome, and of course, after the Great Schism, he becomes the first in honor in the Eastern Chalcedonian world. Of the powers which the ecumenical patriarch still has today, one of them stands out as important on our journey to Ukraine, and that is the power to give consent in setting up a new autocephalous or autonomous church, a new independent church. To get from there to Ukraine, though, we need first to consider very briefly the Great Schism of 1054. Of course, this is a date that is well known. We're all aware of it. The debate that gave rise to it concerned the status of the Patriarch of Constantinople, and that raised the issue of the primacy of Rome. The West considered that primacy to be one of direct apostolic and therefore divine origin, and as John Meyendorff writes, Rome considered that it held a traditional primacy of honor and authority that must be transformed into a real power of jurisdiction, universal in scope and absolute in nature, close quote. The East, however, saw that primacy as one of ecclesiastical law, the exact significance of which was to be defined by the councils. Outright hostility, excuse me, over those divergent views emerged, as we are all aware, in the 9th century, and this arose in relation to the filioque in the Creed. And that theological dispute went to the core of what the two sides considered to be the nature of church. For those in the East, it was the Eucharistic ecclesiology and episcopal ontology alone that could give witness to truth, including in matters of the nature of Christ, and so the filioque. What might appear the innocent inclusion of the filioque in the Mass in the Western Church was considered anything but innocent in the East, where the Creed, established by the only body capable of pronouncing on a matter of faith, the Ecumenical Council, and in this case, the Council of Nicaea in 325, was unalterable even by the Pope, whose position was one of the traditional primacy of honor and authority, but not that of jurisdiction universal in scope and absolute in nature. That issue goes to the very core of the normative canon law. Bishop Callistos Ware writes, and I quote, "The doctrinal definitions of the councils possess an absolute and unalterable validity. Doctrinal definitions deal with eternal truths, where Rome thinks in terms of the supremacy of the universal jurisdiction of the Pope. Orthodoxy thinks in terms of the 5 patriarchs and of the ecumenical councils, where Rome stresses papal infallibility, Orthodox stress the infallibility of the church as a whole," close quote. What mattered in the dispute between East and West was the doctrinal definition of eternal truths. Only an ecumenical council had the power to make and to alter those definitions, and therein lay the difference and the dispute with respect to the filioque. And as we know, the final catastrophic conclusion of the dispute came when papal legates to Constantinople, ostensibly there to seek some form of reunion, were ignored by the ecumenical patriarch, following which, to quote Meyendorff, they stalked into Hagia Sophia during the celebration of the liturgy, deposited their famous sentence of excommunication on the high altar, and then stalked out again, shaking the dust symbolically from their feet. The patriarch and his clergy were excommunicated for the most unlikely of crimes, for having omitted the filioque from the creed and for allowing the marriage of the clergy, among others. The ecumenical patriarch replied by summoning a synod and having the legates excommunicated in spite of attempts of the emperor to smooth things over, close quote. I want to move now into, with that background, into the movement of Byzantine Christianity into Ukraine. And for that, we really need to divide this next part of the journey into 2 periods. One is the pre-schism, Great Schism period, and one is the post-Great Schism period. So first, to look at the pre-Great Schism period, there's evidence of missionary activity in the Slavic lands as early as 867, and that's largely associated with Saint Cyril and Methodius, who were Byzantine theologians, and they were also, and are today, known as the apostles to the Slavs. And the 2 missionaries translated the Bible and liturgical books into the local spoken language and created the written Church Slavonic, or Old Slavonic, which is still the common liturgical language of all Slavs, all Slavic peoples. A century later, Prince Volodymyr of Kiev sent representatives to Constantinople to investigate the nature of Christianity as it was practiced there. And John Binns writes that, and I quote, "They reported their impressions of attending the liturgy at the great church in the 10th century with open-mouthed amazement." And to quote those emissaries themselves, they said, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for surely there is no such splendor or beauty anywhere on earth. We cannot describe it to you. We cannot forget that beauty," close quote. This led ultimately to Volodymyr's baptism, followed in 988 by the mass baptism or Christianization of the Slavic peoples. And Volodymyr's son, Yaroslav, who between 1036 and 1054 built Hagia Sophia in Kiev, which used the liturgy of the great church in Constantinople in the celebration of the Divine Liturgy. The Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, as the mother church, had canonical jurisdiction over the whole of the Slavic lands as a centralized missionary diocese. The metropolitans of Kiev and Rus came from Byzantium and enjoyed canonical and administrative authority over the bishops and the clergy who were chosen locally. As such, the Metropolitanate of Kiev-Rus was one Ukrainian missionary church in the lands that would become Ukraine, and that was in the pre-schism, Great Schism period between 988 and 1054. From there, the post-schism journey takes, again, two branches. The first branch of that journey concerns the events that would lead to the emergence of the Russian Orthodox Church, or as it's sometimes abbreviated, the ROC. During the mid-14th century, Kievan powers were defeated by the Tatars, and what is now Ukraine, including Kiev itself, was absorbed by Lithuania and Poland, the crowns of which were united under a single ruler in 1386, and which came under Roman Catholic jurisdiction. Because Kiev itself fell into ruin and was largely abandoned, Metropolitan Peter, between 1308 and 1326, moved the Metropolitanate of Kiev to Moscow. And between the 15th and the 16th centuries, three events led to the autocephaly of the Kievan Rus Church. First, in 1448, acting on its own, the Kievan Rus Church enthroned a new Metropolitan of Kiev and all Rus, who was named Jonas, to the See of Moscow. Second, in 1488, Constantinople granted autonomy to the Kievan Rus Church. And finally, in 1589, Patriarch Jeremias of Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarch, visited Moscow to seek support in the struggle against Ottoman rule. And while he was there, he installed a metropolitan of the Kievan Rusian Church, who was Job at that time. He was installed as Patriarch of Moscow. And through these events, the Russian Orthodox Church emerges. Still, it was only accorded fifth position in the hierarchy of sees, position which it still has today after Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. The Russian Orthodox Church continued to grow, though, and in time it became an alternative center even to the authority of Constantinople. And John Meindorf concludes that, and I quote, Moscow was henceforth the third Rome. Ancient Rome was now heretical. The new Rome was groaning under the yoke of the Turks. The third Rome alone remained intact. The theocratic ideal of a universal Christian empire thus found its last refuge in Moscow, close quote. For the purposes of our journey, though, this gives us the position that the Russian Orthodox Church is established as an autocephalous church. The second part of the journey, the second branch of the journey, involves the authority of the Russian Orthodox Church over the lands that would become Ukraine. Following the election of Jonas to the See of Moscow in 1448, as I've just recounted, there did, however, remain a bishop, Isidore, in Kiev, and he retained at least nominal authority over that diocese. When Isidore resigned in 1458, because Kiev was within Polish Roman Catholic jurisdiction, as I said a moment ago, Rome appointed his successor, Gregory Bulgarin, who was consecrated not by the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, but by a Patriarch of Constantinople who had been appointed by and was resident in Rome. Bulgarin maintained union with Rome for 12 years, after which he accepted the authority of the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Ecumenical Patriarch appointed Bulgarin's successor as Metropolitan of Kiev. During the 17th century, the lands, including Kiev, were annexed to the Romanov Muscovite Empire. And in 1686, the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople formally approved the canonical jurisdiction, albeit in qualified terms, of the Patriarchate of Moscow over the Metropolitanate of Kiev in what is known as the Letter of Issue or Permission of 1686. And this 1686 is really a key moment in the story that will follow in relation to the Ukrainian Orthodox churches that follow up to our own time. So 1686 is a key moment. This letter of issue, this permission of canonical jurisdiction of the Patriarchate of Moscow over the Metropolitanate of Kiev. So what that meant then is that the political events of the mid-15th to the late 17th centuries brought about the autocephaly and canonical authority of the Russian Orthodox Church, itself the product of ecclesiological developments from the 14th to the 16th centuries. So it brought about autocephaly and canonical authority of the Russian Orthodox Church over what would become the modern Ukrainian Orthodox churches. So that's a part of the story that we're going to come back to. But what emerges then from 1686 is a Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. So that's sometimes abbreviated as the UOCMP. You'll see that abbreviation. Things remained more or less the same up until 1917 in the October Revolution. At that time, an autocephalist movement emerged in Ukraine and in fact held a sobor or synod in Kiev in 1921. The delegates were attempting to find an Orthodox hierarch to lead an autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but were unable to find one and therefore decided to create a Ukrainian episcopate themselves without any consecrating bishop. And this resulted in the establishment of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, or as you'll sometimes see it abbreviated, the UAOC. The rest of the Orthodox world never recognized that Ukrainian hierarchy of the UAOC, Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. And in fact, it was liquidated by the Soviets in the 1930s, revived again during the Second World War, suppressed again by the Soviets at the end of that war, and then finally revived again in 1989. So as of 1989, there existed, in terms of the Orthodox churches, a Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, not recognized by any of the Orthodox world. Things soon changed, however, from 1989, obviously the breakup of the former Soviet Union, and with the emergence of nationalist movements, including that nationalist movement that emerges in Ukraine. So things began to change again. In 1991, Ukraine became an independent nation with its capital in Kiev. And John Binns wrote of this immediate post-Soviet period, and I quote, that the same aspirations that produce a new nation also encourage a new church. The situation is further complicated by political and personal rivalry and ambition. The most confused situation, Binns said, is found in Ukraine, close quote. So indeed, with an independent state, many Ukrainians wanted an independent church. And in the mid-1990s, the UAOC itself split into two, leaving the UAOC, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church that emerged in 1921 and then went through successive stages to 1989. So it left that church. And then a new Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev Patriarchate, or as it's sometimes abbreviated, the UOCKP. Neither of the two resulting churches, remember the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, was not recognized by the Orthodox Communion, nor was the UOCKP, the Kiev Patriarchate. And most notably, of course, it was not recognized. The UOCKP was not recognized by the Russian Orthodox Church. This then left, at that stage, in the mid-1990s, three Orthodox churches in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, which we already heard about, that was continued to be the largest Orthodox group. The UAOC, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, the smallest of the three Orthodox churches. And then the third, the new UOCKP, the Kiev Patriarchate, the second largest Orthodox group. So by 2016, that was the picture of the Ukrainian Orthodox churches in Ukraine. And I'll just quickly, in terms of my slides, I can show you this slide, which shows, this is not actually that should actually say three churches, sorry, I'll have to change that. But what that shows is the distribution of the various churches that I've just been talking about throughout Ukraine. In fact, what is not shown there is the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church. That those numbers were so small and largely in the west and the center that they're not actually shown on that map. But it gives you an idea of where the different Orthodox churches existed. If you look in the east, the eastern part of Ukraine, that's largely where you have Ukrainian Orthodox Moscow Patriarchate. And then moving across to the west, you start to have places where there are both Moscow and Kiev Patriarchate until you get to the west, where you have a church, which I'm going to be talking about in a moment. So that was the position, by and large, by the time that you get to 2016 in Ukraine. So that picture, though, in 2016 is about to change again. But before I get to that part of the journey, I want to turn back again for a briefly, I should say, back to really the 15th and the 16th centuries, and what I call the first of two modern schisms, or what we might call a little schism in 1596. For that, we need to go back to the Council of Florence, which was held in 1438 and 1438-39. And that attempted a short-lived reunion of East and West, and it was premised on a simple formula that if an Eastern church was going to reunite or enter into reunion with the West, it would need to accept the authority of Rome. It would have to accept specifically Roman doctrines, including the Filioque, and however, it would be entitled to retain its Eastern liturgy and traditions. So as I've just recounted, by the 15th century, the united Polish-Lithuanian crown and the majority of the population of what is now Ukraine were Roman Catholic, although there remained a sizable number of Orthodox Christians. The Patriarch of Constantinople had limited authority by this stage, and the bishops were, as I've already said, being appointed out of Rome. Unsurprisingly, this led to political friction between the Orthodox faithful and Roman Catholic rulers. In 1596, in an effort to alleviate that friction, the Metropolitan of Kiev, Michael Ragoza, and a majority of Ukrainian bishops, remember these would have been Ukrainian bishops of the Kievan Patriarchate or the Moscow Patriarchate, using the Florence formula, signed the Union of Brest-Litovsk in 1596. And in exchange for certain guarantees, the signing bishops agreed to recognize the authority of the Pope. This established what would come to be known as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which is the church of which I am a priest, and that's sometimes abbreviated as the UGCC. From the perspective of those who signed, Kazimir Kukarik writes that the union was to ensure, and I quote, the retention in toto of the Greek Catholics' right, liturgical usage, and discipline, and that all of these matters be left in their own hands and jurisdiction. Nor were there any doctrinal or dogmatic difficulties to be resolved. Union with the Holy See therefore consisted chiefly of shifting ecclesiastical jurisdictional dependence from the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople to that of the See of Rome. And Kukarik goes on to say that the Holy See concurred completely on all counts and gladly guaranteed that all liturgical matters would be left to the Ukrainian prelates and their successors. And to quote from the official constitution of Pope Clement VIII, which was signed on the 23rd of December, 1595, Pope Clement wrote that we receive, unite, join, annex, and incorporate our members in Christ, and to enhance more greatly the meaning of our love for all the sacred rites and ceremonies themselves, which the bishops and clergy use, as established by the Holy Greek Fathers, with apostolic graciousness we permit, concede, and allow them to the same Ukrainian bishops and clergy, close quote. So while the hierarchs accepted union in 1596, many Orthodox faithful remained Orthodox. And following the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century, many Greek Catholics returned to Orthodoxy, although the majority remained faithful to Rome until 1946, when the church was liquidated by the Soviets and entered a period in which it was known as the Church Underground, or the Church of the Catacombs. And it was not until the Glasnost of the late 1980s that it was legalized again. And by the mid-1990s, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, having re-emerged from the catacombs, had around 2,700 parishes in Ukraine and numbered about 7 million people worldwide. Just to come back to our map then, that sort of completes the picture. Over in the west here, the blue crosses, that is where you have predominantly, that is where the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church predominates. Now, without going into the intricacies of Eastern Catholic canon law, which governs all Eastern Catholic churches, including the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the church itself is canonically a church which is considered sui juris within the Catholic Communion, and its hierarch is the major archbishop of Kiev, Halych, and all Ruthenia. The current hierarch is Major Archbishop Sviatoslav. The title itself, Major Archbishop, is something that was introduced to Catholic canon law in the 1960s, and it's not a term or an office that is found in Byzantine Christianity. Rather, it's unique to the Eastern Catholic world. Ukrainian Catholics, however, refer to the hierarch as a patriarch, although requests for canonical recognition as such have been unsuccessful, which takes me to the final consequence of 1596. Whether the Union of Brest is viewed as schism or as union depends on one's perspective. From the Catholic perspective, it is viewed as a reunion of East and West. From the Orthodox perspective, it is considered a break, perhaps, as I've said earlier, a little schism, which produced, as Bishop Kallistos Ware concluded, a sharp division between the continuing Orthodox on the one side and the Greek Catholics on the other. Close quote. Far from alleviating friction, the Union seems to have prolonged it in other forms. In the late 1980s, it caused difficulties in the work of the Joint International Commission for Theological Dialogue between Orthodoxy and Rome, and this intensified, in fact, in 2004, when efforts to discuss the possibility of a Ukrainian Catholic Patriarchate were met with opposition from both the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Moscow, as well as by all the heads of the local national Orthodox churches. There was unanimous agreement among them that any Roman pursuit of a patriarchal church would result in the breaking off of ecumenical dialogue. And in the 35 years since emerging from the catacombs, very little progress seems to have been made on this stalemate, be it the Orthodox attitude to what are sometimes known as pejoratively uniates, or the Roman treatment of these refugees from Byzantium. Well, Ukrainian Catholics might be seen as a bridge between East and West. More often, they sometimes prove to be a stumbling block in that ecumenical dialogue. In any case, by 2016, what this all meant is that there was a fourth Byzantine Chalcedonian church, along with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate. And that fourth church was the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And that was the country's and is the country's second largest Christian church and the largest one in the western part of the country. So what we have now is a rough outline of the four major churches, Byzantine Chalcedonian Christian churches of Ukraine as of 2016. But again, as I said earlier, that picture was about to change in 2016. In 2015, so this takes me then to the final part of the journey, the final part of the story, the final, what has been referred to as the final schism of 2018, 2019. So going back to 2015, Bishop Kallistos Ware wrote that, and I quote, "The only long-term solution would seem to be a fully independent Ukrainian autocephalous church. This would need," Bishop Kallistos wrote, "the recognition of the Moscow Patriarchate and also that of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, to whose jurisdiction Ukraine belonged before 1686, close quote. So what we see there, I think, is really represented very well two points. One is to come back again to that point I made earlier about the Byzantine mindset and the way in which the emergence of a new independent church is not one that follows sort of a straight line. It is somewhat, as I've said a couple of times already, somewhat messier than that. The idea that you would need the recognition of both the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ecumenical Patriarchate might lead some in the West to think, well, isn't there actually a clear process to doing this? And the answer to that question is not necessarily. And that's, I think, what Bishop Callistos was getting at. The other point that is important in that quote is this idea of 1686, the letter of issue of 1686, which, as I've said earlier, is that moment in which canonical jurisdictional authority is given to the Russian Orthodox Church over the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. So two important points there, the Byzantine mindset and 1686. So that solution, the idea of a Ukrainian autocephalous church, nonetheless seemed to be a real possibility when in 2016 and 2018, the president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, made two separate requests to the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople for the establishment of an autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church. On the 11th of October 2018, after a regular synod, the Patriarchate of Constantinople made four historic announcements. First, that it would proceed to the granting of autocephaly to the Church of Ukraine, independent of the Russian Orthodox Church. Second, that it would reestablish a Stauropagion, or a church body ruled directly by the Ecumenical Patriarch in Kiev. Third, that it would withdraw the 332-year-old qualified acceptance of the Russian Orthodox Church's canonical jurisdiction over the Kievan Church contained in the 1686 letter of issue. And finally, the Patriarchate of Constantinople announced that it would lift the excommunication of Patriarch Filaret of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kiev Patriarchate, and Metropolitan Makary of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. And that would canonically reinstate both bishops to their hierarchical rank and their faithful to communion with the Orthodox Church. Remember, neither one of those churches had been recognized by the Orthodox world until this moment. Those actions both reestablished Constantinople as the mother church capable of establishing a new local autocephalous church in Ukraine, and laid the groundwork to effect that unification from the two existing churches, the UOC-KP and the UAOC, as well as from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. That's what the events of 2018 and those four major announcements from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, that's the effect of them. Following those decisions of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, on the 15th of December 2018, the clergy of the UOC Moscow Patriarchate, the UOC Kiev Patriarchate, and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, so the three existing Ukrainian Orthodox churches at that point, convoked a unification church council in Hagia Sophia in Kiev. And on the 5th of January 2019, Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarch, signed the document known as the Patriarchal and Synodal Tomos for the bestowal of the ecclesiastical status of autocephaly to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. In other words, this was a decree of canonical independence, or autocephaly conferred upon, bestowed upon a Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And this founded the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, or as you'll sometimes see it abbreviated, the OCU. So that united the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate, and those of the UOC, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate hierarchy. So those of that hierarchy that chose to join the union were also part of this union that formed the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So this also had the effect of constituting the OCU, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, as one of the local national Orthodox churches in the world. So again, that recognition which had eluded the Autocephalous Church and the Kiev Patriarchate for all of those years was now conferred upon, and that church took its place within that communion, of local national Orthodox churches. What this did not mean, however, was that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate ceased to exist. It did not mean that. Rather, those who did not accept union as part of the OCU remained part of the UOC-MP, which continued. This is a clear example, again, as I've said several times now, of the Byzantine mindset in relation to governance, as opposed to any sort of formal process. It was and it is messy. And that goes back to that quote of Bishop Callistos, the idea that it would have required the approval and the acceptance of both the major patriarchates, Constantinople and Moscow. That didn't happen. So that shows that idea of the messiness of that Byzantine mindset that flows all the way through this history. So that means that it remains canonically unclear whether the UOC, Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, falls under the jurisdiction of the Russian Orthodox Church or of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. Both sides make claims, the types of claims that you might expect. The UOC Moscow Patriarchate, that the events of 2016 to 2019 changed nothing. Really, that's the Russian Orthodox Church that makes that claim. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, of course, that those events changed everything. And so, nonetheless, following, or more importantly, I should say, following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the support expressed for that action by Patriarch Kirill of Moscow earlier this year, on the 27th of May of this year, 2022, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate itself passed a resolution removing all mention of the Moscow Patriarchate from its statute, and many parishes have since left the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. As a result, instead of the 3 Orthodox churches that had existed in Ukraine up until 2018, of which only the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate was a recognized canonical body in the Orthodox world, there now exist 2. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine, headed by Metropolitan Epiphanius of Kiev and all Ukraine, who had been elected at the Unification Council in 2018, and the continuing Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, headed by Metropolitan Onufrius of Kiev and all Ukraine. 2 metropolitans of Kiev and all Ukraine, 2 different Orthodox churches. And how, one might ask, does the rest of the Orthodox world recognize those two churches? Not surprisingly, the decision of Constantinople to exert authority as the mother church and to establish the OCU led the Russian Orthodox Church on the 15th of October of 2018 to break communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, marking the beginning of what James Shure has called the final schism. Put simply, just as there are 2 views of the events of 1596 and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, there are equally 2 views of the effect of the 2019 Tomos. While some saw it as an organic development, both theologically and politically, in the emergence of the Ukrainian nation and of its Christian faithful, consistent with the establishment of autocephalous local national churches, according to ancient Byzantine Christian tradition. For others, particularly the Russian Orthodox Church, it was seen very differently. In fact, James Shure wrote, and I quote, "The granting of the Tomos might well signify the greatest cleft in Orthodox Christianity since the Muscovite Church declared its independence from Constantinople and proclaimed its own patriarchal status in 1589, close quote. Thus, while uniting many Orthodox Christians in Ukraine, these events have also precipitated division, if not ecclesiological schism, in the wider Orthodox world. The Russian Orthodox Church's strong opposition, for instance, is why many Ukrainian Orthodox Moscow Patriarchate parishes continued to exist following the union. If you remember that map I showed earlier, in the east, you would have seen there were still Moscow Patriarchate crosses there. That map is pre the union that creates the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but it sort of shows the distribution of where the previous churches would have been. And it was in the east where you had the greatest predominance of the Moscow Patriarchate parishes. Although, as I've said, even the fact that some of those parishes remained in the Moscow Patriarchate changed following the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. Moreover, because the Russian Orthodox Church has made clear that it would break communion with any hierarch of the Church of Greece that entered into communion with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the events of 2019 have made for difficult relations between those two Orthodox churches. And so we come to the end of our journey. Today, through the complex messiness of the Byzantine mindset, as it has been applied to the development and expansion of Orthodox Christianity in the Slavic lands, we have the current position. 3 Ukrainian churches: the OCU, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Just very briefly, the final slide that I have is just, gives a breakdown of religion. I might put that onto full screen. So you just can see some of the numbers there, looking from west across to east. The Orthodox obviously predominates in every region. When you total all of the 3 churches that existed before the Union, creating the OCU, those numbers would have been, in the west 57%, center 76, 77%, south 71, 63%, the east 50% in the Donbass. And then on the third row down is the Greek Catholic, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and you can see there that those numbers are largest in the west and then diminish to nothing by the time you get to the east. The final, the one other slide I'll just show you is this kind of mirrors what I've just been saying about the numbers. If you look at the distribution of ethnicity and language across the map of Ukraine, you find that as you go from west to east, you find that there is mostly Ukrainian speaking in the west, obviously, and by the time you get to the east, there's a lot of either ethnic Russians or Russian speaking population in the east. So I'll stop share. Thank you very much. Very grateful to you for joining, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really fascinating lecture. You've given us so much to think about and covered so much ground. Stuff that for me a little bit more familiar, the earlier history, but a lot of very new to me, very new information about the canonical context in Ukraine, Moscow, and Constantinople. Really, really interesting. I'm sure there will be questions. If people want to find the blue hand button, raise hand, to indicate if they want to ask a question. Perhaps if I kick off, in the Anglican Communion, we sometimes have parishes that want to change jurisdiction for the sake of a better word, often to a new Anglican jurisdiction. So there are some parallels, and as well as the messiness of canonical considerations, there's also the interaction with civil law about the property, the buildings and that sort of thing. And I was wondering, when you were talking about the churches, some churches of the UOCMP moving to the UOC and some not, and the canonical messiness of that, how is there any interaction with the civil law and the property of those churches?
I have to say that there absolutely is a lot of interaction. That was one of the major issues that arose following the collapse of the Soviet Union, is various churches that had been, say for the Ukrainian Greek Catholics, for instance, a lot of church property when the church was liquidated was seized and became used by other Orthodox churches. And then when the Soviet Union broke up, the question is, well, how are we going to deal with those property issues? There were, talk about messiness, there was a lot of messiness, and it led to political division. There was violence in some instances. There's obviously legal disputes. I don't even know that all of that has even been resolved to this day. So absolutely, there was a lot of, on the civil law side, absolutely a great deal of messiness, perhaps even more messiness than on the canonical side.
Great, thank you very much. I see we've got a question from Bishop Christopher, our president of the ELS. Christopher. Do you need to unmute? Sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, there we are.
Thank you. Good. First of all, just to echo our thanks, Father, for that very clear exposition, an extraordinarily complicated picture and history. Just a comment really on the last comment. I was in Kiev about 5 or 6 years ago in conjunction with the Conference of European Churches when I was then president. Already there were the issue of transfer of congregations from one jurisdiction to another. And what I was very interested in is that with the civil constitution of an independent Ukraine, the old Soviet legislation on that sort of matter of religious associations remained virtually untouched. It may have changed now, but it was virtually untouched. The Soviet interest was, of course, as much division between any Christian groups as possible. And so what appertained 6 or 7 years ago, it may still happen, is that to leave one jurisdiction for another in terms of church building and property and any money, the situation was the church council, the local church council, needed to pass a resolution by a majority. And then that was passed to the civic parish council. And if the civic parish council accepted it, which they usually did, then the whole legal ownership of property and the church building was automatically transferred then to the other jurisdiction. So that made actually transfer relatively easy, rightly or wrongly. That certainly couldn't happen in the Church of England, but it can happen like that, I think, in other parts of the Anglican Communion. So there is some fascinating civil law reflection on the story, the complicated story of the church in the Ukraine. But again, I real sincere thanks to you for a very, very clear lecture.
Thank you so much. And yes, I think that, property issues, I mean, there's been entire, there are books written about the issues and relating to church real property. And I think that that is an issue that comes up in every, civil jurisdiction the world over. But thank you very much for that comment about Ukraine. I mean, I think that that's very helpful. I did know a little bit about the idea that the Soviet law continued to apply sort of, that gets into some sort of, that gets into detailed sort of constitutional theory as to when one state has achieved autochthony in relation to the breakup of a previous state. And I think that that was part of that process. And I think you're quite right. I think there may even still to this day be, Soviet law that has been left untouched because it just hasn't been dealt with by the new Ukrainian parliament.
Another bishop with a hand up, Bishop John, you have a question. Sorry, you're still muted, John.
There we
That's
go.
it.
Yep.
Good. Thank you. Paul, thank you very much. It's lovely to see you from the other side of the world.
Good to see you too.
I wonder whether you're able to comment at all about nominations for episcopal ordination and how they might be arrived at.
I could say a little bit about the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, I suppose. But in terms of the Orthodox side of things, I'm a little bit less, I feel on shakier ground there talking about how those nominations, I mean, I know sort of the theology of ordination and around the consecration service is the idea that the community, this is even going back to Zizioulas and Eucharistic ecclesiology, the idea that it is the community. In fact, the consecration service itself mentions the community, which is sort of you're requesting that this bishop become their bishop. So I think that's the theology that it emerges from the community. In practice, how that happens, I'm on shakier ground. I mean, certainly in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic position, it is very much a matter of the synod of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic bishops that do have the ability to make a decision, but that in a major archiepiscopal church such as we are, that still has to be approved by Rome once somebody is selected as a possible bishop in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. So that's kind of that is a bit of a, I think perhaps a slight problem where we are not the tradition of the Orthodox tradition, the Eastern tradition of how bishops are selected is not followed in precisely the same way in the Greek Catholic tradition.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I see we've got two more questions, and appreciating that the time's getting on for you. It's late evening in Australia. Probably we'll stick to those two questions if we may. So I think the first to come up with Steve.
Yes.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I did well, I think, to get past trying to work out what on earth 80 priests did at Hagia Sophia, and with all the acolytes as well. Can you just clarify, because when you got to what happened after the Russian invasion, you were saying that the CMP withdrew sort of connections with Moscow, but presumably not in the eastern parts of the land.
Well, I think that in fact the Ukrainian, so that the Moscow Patriarchate withdrew mention of the Patriarch of Moscow in its statute, and then that meant that they did not commemorate the Patriarch of Moscow in the liturgy. So that's what ended up happening following the invasion. Some parishes left on their own, and they shifted, to one of the other churches, or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, I should say. But yes, that's what happened in the immediate post-invasion period.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul. And last question from Olga.
Yes, it's more of an historical question, and it goes partly to the fact that I haven't actually been taking notes as you spoke, but the older of the two churches that was not recognized by the rest of the Orthodox world. I'm afraid I've forgotten the acronym. Perhaps you just remind me so I know what I'm talking about.
The UAOC, Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, UAOC, yeah.
When you spoke about the origin of the UAOC,
Yes.
unless I misheard, you said something to the effect that they set themselves up without any consecrating bishops.
Right, that's correct.
Does that mean it was a presbyteral ordination?
I think it was, there were, yes, I think that must have been, or I don't even, to be honest, I'm not even sure exactly how that actually took place, but there would have been presbyters, that's right. There wouldn't have been an episcopate that actually ordained that hierarch.
Right. Yes, I'm surprised that they even managed what they did manage in the Orthodox world in that case. I think the Presbyterian world might have been more friendly.
Yes.
I see. It's a really interesting question, Olga, because I thought of that too. I see that Bishop Christopher's
yes,
stood on a.
Maybe he can enlighten us as to how that happened.
Unmute, Christopher.
Thank you. I don't want to prolong because we are in very different time zones, Paul. Thank you. I was also mulling on that question. Yes, I believe that church was constituted by presbyteral ordination of an episcopate.
Yes.
That, of course, has happened before. Alexandria used to do that in ancient days. But that was one of the reasons why the other Orthodox churches didn't
recognize, correct, right.
What my colleague as a co-president of the Conference of European Churches was the then Metropolitan of France, Metropolitan Emmanuel, who is he's now Metropolitan of Chalcedon, and is very much in the heart of things in terms of the ecumenical patriarchate. And there was a rumbling discussion in Constantinople as to how that church could be reconciled, and it has been reconciled now. But what they did about those bishops who had been presbyterally ordained to the episcopate, I do not know, and it's a very interesting question. But I suspect it won't have been just a plain reordination. I think it will have, because the Orthodox theology of ordination, as Paul has hinted with quotations from John Zizoulas, is of the community invoking the spirit. It's not a historical, it is his historical succession, but it's more a contemporary ordination through the spirit by the community. So there's a very interesting little book to be written about that. On
I
the
think that's right.
reconciliation of churches and ministries. But thank you.
Yes,
sorry.
I agree. Thank you, Your Grace.
Well, fantastic. Really interesting point for us all to think more of that. Well, just want to say again, Paul, thank you so much for addressing us late into your evening. Really appreciate it. All the expertise and knowledge that you brought. You see the applause there in the in Zoom. You said at the beginning that you weren't an historian or theologian, but I think you wove together the history, the theology, and the canon law so masterfully. So we're really grateful for that. Just want to say to members, do keep an eye on the website. We've got more online events coming up, and in the next few days, some of our London lectures and the day conference information will be posted as well, and going out to members. So very good to see everyone. Thank you again, Paul. Really appreciate all you've done today. I've certainly made 3 pages of notes to go away and read and think about. So thank you very much, and good evening and good day to everyone. Bye.
Thanks so much, Russell. Take care, and good night, everyone. Thank you. Or good day, everyone. Take care.